Okay, so today let's talk about extroverts and introverts and are they compatible for a romantic relationship? And I made a PowerPoint again, so I'll share my screen. Okay. So first of all, in talking about compatibility, let's first define extroversion and introversion. So Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, really the father of the MBTI, although the MBTI is named Myers-Briggs after two women, Myers and Briggs, who took his theory and furthered it and came up with the MBTI test. Carl Jung is really the originator of these ideas, and he's the one who first spoke about extroversion and introversion. So the way he defined it is extroversion as an outward movement of interest towards the object. The object works like a magnet upon the tendencies of the subject. Now, the object here, notice he said the object, he didn't say a person, although a person can be the object of the extrovert's attention. The earliest signs of the earliest signs of extroversion in a child is his quick adaptation to the environment and the extraordinary attention he gives to objects, and especially the effect he has on them. So you might recognize extroverted children as like you take one to the playground and like they run towards it. They're all in on it. They're not the one who's like hanging back and observing and watching before they jump in. They're ready to go. Whereas introversion is a movement of interest away from the object to the subject. It looks, one might say, as though all life energy were ultimately seeking the subject. The introvert is not so forthcoming. He is as though in continual retreat before the object. He holds aloof from external happenings. So what we're seeing here is not so much the popular like pop culture definition of an extrovert as being like super social and super talky, and an introvert being like really quiet and just head in the clouds or head in the book, don't talk to anyone. What we're really seeing is a primary orientation of the person to the external or towards the internal. So in MBTI, extroversion doesn't mean how social you are, although it can do with sociality. It means your first cognitive function, your primary orientation to the world, is an extroverted cognitive function, either SENETE or FE, and not all of these are social functions. Whereas the introvert has a primary cognitive function that is introverted, focused internally. So then what about ambiverts? In MBTI, this term just doesn't even exist because it is meaningless in terms of MBTI. We have in our cognitive stack both extroverted and introverted cognitive functions, and we have an equal number of both, because what we are doing is balancing our external and internal perceptions and judgments. You know, our internal perception versus that of the world, our internal judgments versus those of the world, in a balancing act. And of course, you have a primary orientation towards one or the other, and that determines whether you are called an extrovert or introvert. So it has nothing to do with like this thing of like, oh, sometimes I like to be with people and sometimes I like to be alone. Like, yeah, so does almost everybody in the world. Like, I think it's funny that people are like, oh, people don't understand me because sometimes I talk and sometimes I don't talk. Like, yeah, that's freaking everybody. So, except for like the very, very extremes, which Carl Jung would say there is no such thing as a pure extrovert or pure introvert. either person would be completely insane. So what we are referring to is whether the primary process is oriented externally or internally. So, someone who's extroverted in terms of their MBTI type may not appear as a social person, or they may. For example, extroverted intuition, NE, that's the ENTP and ENFP, is oriented towards external possibilities and connections rather than towards making a whole bunch of friends. So are they compatible, extroverts and introverts? When it comes to MBTI, there's not much insight to be gained from looking at just extroverts and introverts in terms of compatibility. We have to examine the types and their functions and cannot generalize extroverts as a whole or introverts as a whole. So for example, an INFJ follows a completely different process and way of seeing the world than an INFP or an ISTJ. And they're actually more compatible with an extrovert ENFJ than with a fellow introvert ISTJ. So it matters what kind of extrovert and what kind of introvert we are talking about here. So, more compatibility information lies within the big 5 aspects. So we can look at this scale and definition of extroversion, introversion, and introversion in the more popular sense to gain better information about whether they're compatible or not. If you're not familiar with the big 5, the big 5 factors measure 5 factors of personality: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And all of these are defined or measured on a scale instead of dichotomies of like you're either extrovert or introvert. Here's where we get like the whole ambivert, although Big 5 doesn't use this word either. Most people, like 90% of people, find themselves, somewhere in the middle regarding extroversion and introversion. And here we find incompatibility among people who are on the more extreme ends of the scale, which I'll show in the next slide. But for the introvert and the extrovert, there is utility in having someone who is slightly higher or lower than them on the scale when it comes to performing certain duties and social roles. However, the two find comfort in relationships where they are relatively close to each other on the scale. So I made this chart of compatibility based on Big 5 extroversion scores. So this is like, somebody who scores 90% in extroversion, versus somebody who scores 10% in extroversion. These guys on the far ends are not so compatible with each other. We really see the greatest amount of compatibility with people who score like, within a range of like 30% of where we are in either direction. And regarding this, I do have a couple of anecdotes. I've spoken recently to a couple of guys, one who got divorced and one who is very much considering divorce from his wife. And I asked them like, why'd you get divorced? Or why are you considering divorce? And they both cited 2 Big 5 factors, like without talking about them directly. What they were talking about was the Big 5 factors of conscientiousness and extroversion. So in terms of these 2 factors, the 2 couples were just too much misaligned. Both of these guys are very high in extroversion, some of the most extroverted people I know. And they both have complaints about how their wives are too basically introverted, how they are super social people. They want to go out and they want to host a lot of people at their house. They want to host a lot of dinners and events out. And the a woman, introverts, will get tired of this very early and basically disengage from the group. And then, kind of like sit in the back and be quiet, not talk to anybody. Or one guy talked about how his wife just straight up just left the restaurant and sat in the parking lot, and he went out and he's like, hey, what are you doing? Everybody's here. We're breaking bread. Like, come back in. And she's like, no, I want to go home. I don't want to come in there. So of course, it seems the understanding of personality type could definitely remedy this situation. It's like, she's not being an asshole or something. She's an introvert and her battery is dead, and you're pushing her a little bit too hard here, and vice versa. So there is an incompatibility, but I do think that in terms of extroversion and introversion, it's really not that difficult to communicate and understand the other person's perspective, and to not push your own standards and expectations on the other person, and to be able to attachment style has contributed towards everybody I've ever heard talk of being in an unhealthy relationship or breaking up or being divorced, like either directly or indirectly talking about attachment style. Because what's wrong with okay, you go out and your introverted wife can stay home and do her own thing. It's kind of a codependent behavior of we have to be together and do the same things and be feeling the same good feelings all the time. If you have this enmeshment of emotions, then only so much, you can only be so happy in as much that the happiness currently exists. It can never grow. So I hope that makes sense, what I just said. So we do have more on the big five because, in terms of extroversion and introversion, MBTI doesn't offer much here in the way of determining relationship compatibility and forming a discussion around this, but the big five does. So that's why I have integrated it into the website and into the app. So on the website and the app, we have a big five test and compatibility charts. And actually on the app, I have a picture here. We have a big five test, and it gives you compatibility scores for each of the 5 dimensions with each of your potential matches, as well as an MBTI compatibility score and then an overall compatibility score. So you can see you get a score for how well do you match with each other on agreeableness? How well do you match with each other in terms of conscientiousness? And then for the overall compatibility score, we have these weighted in terms of how important compatibility is on this particular dimension to the health of the relationship. It seems that the most important aspects in terms of the big five to compatibility are conscientiousness and trait openness. So we have those weighted slightly higher than the other 3 factors. So if you were ever trying to figure out how we came up with this number, that's how. And then of course the MBTI compatibility number makes up 50%. It's weighted quite heavily. So thank you for watching, and please check out the TypeMatch app, link in the description.
Your personality is unique. It's hard to find someone that understands you. Try dating using personality type matching. Find out who you're compatible with using Myers-Briggs and Big 5 personality scores. Download TypeMatch and start dating by personality type compatibility today. TypeMatch, available on App Store and Play Store.